Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 18 today, A Convulsed Age. This is a kind of an ending part to the first part in this book. So the book we're using, it's broken into chapters, obviously, but it's also broken into sections, and the sections are actually titled parts. So part one that we're finishing up today was entitled The Reformation. So we finished kind of that introductory section on the Reformation. What we will begin next week is part two, and the title of that is Orthodoxy, Rationalism, and Pietism. So we're making a transition today. This chapter is a bit shorter than the ones we've had, so hopefully this episode today will be shorter than what we've had over the last few weeks and get us into the next section of this study. A lot of what we're going to talk about today will be kind of a review and looking back at the time period we're in to draw some conclusions and also set up what's to come. So we'll begin by looking at 16th century Christianity. The 16th century was a pivotal period in the history of Christianity. There can be no question about that. Major events have happened and the stakes are high and things have changed very much. So this is a very fertile time in Christian history. Is not necessarily the brightest time, but it does set up some bright times to come. And you could look at it, though, also as being a great time of Reformation. And there certainly was Reformation that happened. Sadly, it ended with a church split, the second major split. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it also allowed the light of correct doctrine to shine. And so there's negatives and positives, but definitely a pivotal time in all of church history. Two key turning points had been set in motion in the previous century with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the discovery of America in 1492. The reason these are so pivotal is it sets the stage for expansion of Western Europe and Western civilization, and with it Christianity. So the big enemy of the Christian church up until this point had been the Turks. And when Christians thought of the worldwide mission of the church, they thought primarily of the conversion of Muslims that would have been a part of that group. That was what they thought there was left to evangelize. They didn't realize or didn't really think in terms of there being other people around the world that had never heard the gospel. They were presented with the ones that were closest to them that were enemies of the gospel that they thought of as potential converts. That would have been the Muslims. When they thought of challenges to the faith, they also thought of Islam. So, Islam was very aggressively against Christianity, and honestly, Christianity been very aggressively against Islam too. And so while they were also the primary mission target, they were simultaneously the biggest challenge at that time. But all of that is going to change at this period of time. In the course of a century, things changed radically. It really did. Toward the east and south, the challenge of Islam was seemingly countered by the completion of the Spanish Reconquista of 1492, by the failure to take Vienna in 1529, and by the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a crushing defeat was dealt to the Turkish navy. So being able to defeat the Ottoman Turks was a huge deal. The Turks made their big stand to get into Western Europe by the attempt to take Vienna in 1529. When that failed, that really set up the Western world for victory in this matter. And that actually is what took place. Another crushing defeat was the Battle of Lepanto, where the Turkish Navy, which was a very strong navy, was defeated. So things are changing. The enemy that has kind of hemmed in Christianity and hemmed in the West is now out of the way. So there's expansion to be done to the east. But there's also going to be another source of expansion to come. We see that in the Atlantic Ocean. At this time, the Atlantic Ocean ceased to be a barrier to the expansion of both Western civilization and of Christianity. The ability to be able to sail around the world opened up so much and opened up lands that previously were not even known to exist. So this really changed things tremendously. Obviously, you can't underestimate in the course of human history and world history, these events, but certainly also that's going to affect Christianity greatly, because now the mission field has expanded greatly, and the opportunity to move out of what has been known to be the world is going to create so many opportunities. So things are going to be changing quite a bit. As Spain sailed west, it conquered lands larger than Spain itself and established the Roman Catholic faith. So Spain is the primary, at least early on, is the primary country to actually go out and start sailing around the world. And as they do that, they take the Catholic faith with them. Spain is one of the nations that has been staunchly Catholic, maybe even the one that has been that the most. And so they're not going to be taking any Protestant ideas. They're going to be taking the Catholic faith. So the Roman Catholic faith is going to get a big head start in moving west. The Portuguese sailed south around Africa and established trading colonies and missions in the Far East. So you've got Spain going west, Portugal going east, and they're gonna do that same work as they go east. They're going to establish these trading colonies, and with that are going to be missions. And again, a lot of Roman Catholic go along with that. In the lands far across the Atlantic and in others in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Far East, Christianity was establishing firm footholds. There is a move around the world with Western civilization, and with that comes a move around the world with Christianity, and particularly Western Christianity. So expansion is going to be a big deal in this next section that we're about to get into. It's already started, but we're going to begin to see the ramifications of it, and really that's going to carry us almost into modern times. There's more to say about expansion first, though. Those who lived at the time were unaware of the magnitude and consequences of the events they witnessed, and that's really the case for just about any civilization. It's really hard in the span of a human lifetime to understand the events of your lifetime in perspective. You just can't see it all. And even things that are happening now that we think are a huge deal, maybe 100 years from now, it will be looked back on and it wasn't that big a deal. But there may be other events that we're hardly taking notice of and don't think are going to make a big impact that actually it will end up being a bigger deal than we even think they could be. And it takes time. It takes kind of being able to look back on history. And you can do that to a certain extent in the course of a lifetime, but it really takes generations to do that. So this isn't a shocking statement at all. It's the way it is for everyone. We look back on this period of history and we draw conclusions from it that the people that lived in it would probably not even have any awareness of being able to draw those conclusions, and probably would argue with us whether or not they were valid. But that's the way history goes. The Pope felt confident he could avoid conflicts between Spain and Portugal by decreeing that one should sail west and one should sail east. So the Pope's involved in two very Catholic nations, and he dictates to them which way they're going to go. Spain, you get to go to the west, you get to go to the new lands. Portugal, you get to go to the east, you get to go to what's already established, but we've never really had much of a relationship with, because we've been cut off by the Muslims, by the Turks. And so those worlds are going to open up, but the Pope gets involved in state affairs again. This happens time and time again. It's going to continue to happen. And he thinks that he's actually doing something that's going to avoid there being any problems. Well, if you've got a flat earth, this would work because you just go in a straight line linearly till you got too far to go anywhere else, I guess. But when you got a round object, it doesn't matter if you're going in different directions. Eventually, you're going to meet. And that's exactly what happened. It happened unexpectedly, but it should have been expected, because if you go around the world in different directions, you will meet somewhere. And where they met was in the Philippines, and that's going to be where there is a big clash. Outside of Spain and Portugal, few gave much thought to this new world. So people that weren't directly affected by it, Spain and Portugal were, because they were going to establish colonies, they were going to establish trading routes, they were going to be moving people around in an effort to try to get rich out of this new world. So they're going to pay a lot of attention to it, but people that weren't directly affected by it didn't really know much about it. They didn't really think much about it. It's odd to think about that. We look back on history and realize that this was a huge thing. But honestly, probably for the common person, maybe even living in Spain and Portugal, but certainly outside of it, they would have given very little thought to this, at least initially. Even in Spain, King Ferdinand and his grandson Charles V were more concerned with the politics of Western Europe than with the promises of the Atlantic. So a major event, a major deal, a major big event in human history is going to be largely, at least at first, either ignored or not known, or it will be put as a back burner issue by what's going on at home. But that certainly is going to change as we go forward with this. Well, while what's happening around the world and the discovery of trade routes to the east and a new world to the west might not have affected people directly at this point in time, there were big changes in Europe that did. There were momentous changes that actually the entire population of Europe experienced, and they did recognize them being a big deal. Medieval Christianity collapsed. The light of enlightenment, the humanist movement to regain classical learning and knowledge, and even to develop an expansion of that, to bring those ideas into the modern world, it's going to eventually cause that facade of the medieval Christianity to just collapse under its own weight. It can't stand. We see in the Council of Trent the advent of modern Catholicism. And we also see at this time several Protestant confessions that arose. So there's going to kind of be a collapse of medieval Christianity, but the modern version of Catholicism and also the Protestant world getting out of medieval time. It was kind of already at the tail end of it anyway, but it was affected in some ways by medieval thinking. It's going to move on past that too. It didn't have as far to go as the Catholic Church did, but both of them moved beyond medieval Christianity, as it's now going to be a thing of the past. The ancient ideal of a single church with the Pope as its visible head lost its power in the West. It's important to emphasize that this was in the West. In the East, this had already taken place. Remember, we often think of the Protestant Reformation as the big split in the church, the one world church, but actually that had happened long before this. The East and Western churches had a schism that couldn't be resolved, and a permanent split had occurred a long time before. So the Protestant Reformation was not the first split off from the universal one church. Even at this time, there wasn't just a one church. Eastern religion, Eastern Christianity existed, and it had for centuries. So that part of it had already split a long time before. Now we have a second split. So the Protestant Reformation is actually the second unresolved schism that happens in Christianity, in the Christian church. It's not the first, it's the second. But it does make a huge change in the West. The West has progressed past that. They've moved on from the Eastern ways. And that idea in the West was that there could be just a one church. Everybody would be involved in one central church that was ruled or had as its earthly head or visible head the Pope. Well, that idea begins to go away with the Protestant Reformation and the unwillingness of the Catholic Church to in any way consider the doctrinal issues that the Protestants had brought up. It became very clear that there wasn't going to be a recombining of the church, but there was going to be a permanent split off. Reformation had caused that to happen. And so this ideal, this medieval ideal, and maybe even before that, it's going to go away. That people realize that's not going to happen now. It's not going to ever come back together again. From that point on, Western Christianity was divided among various traditions, each exhibiting great cultural and theological differences. And that's going to be one of the huge focuses of our study going forward, is all the different traditions that develop out of this period of time. Obviously, a lot of those are going to take place in the Protestant church, but there'll even be some stuff that occurs also in the Catholic Church as a result of that, and we'll look at both of those areas. In the early 16th century, it was taken for granted that the existence and survival of a state demanded religious agreement among its subjects. The idea that you would give people in being under one rule an opportunity to be involved in any number of different religious traditions, it was absolutely just unheard of. They couldn't even conceive of that. You can't do it that way. Now, you can have different states that do it, but everybody in those states had to do it. We can't survive. If we're not unified, we can't survive. We have to have agreement. And that was the thinking for a long, long time. And it persisted into the early part of the 16th century. But this view of national unity and religious uniformity became the root of the many religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. What people started to see was that you could try to make a rule that says everybody had to have the same religion, but people weren't going along with it. And it was creating a lot of tension, a lot of war. And there were enough people now that you couldn't just go out and burn 2 or 3 heretics and that did it. You were going to have wars between armies. You were going to have periods of time in which there's a lot of war, and it went on and on and on. It happened. We talked about how much it happened in France, but it happened at other places too. And people got fed up with it, honestly. As a result, in some areas sooner than others, the conclusion was reached that religious agreement was not necessary for the security of the state. The price was too high. And you can even go beyond saying that it wasn't necessary. It just wasn't even feasible. It wasn't possible at that point. It wasn't going to happen. And to continue to try to force it to happen and to continue to have wars that were destructive, and you lost people's lives, you lost property, just to go on and on and on with that. People finally realized that's not the way forward. We can't do this. The price is too high, and so the thinking about that began to change as well. Through a long process, one after another of the European states came to adopt policies of religious tolerance. So this process has begun, and it's going to continue on throughout the next part of our study and on into modern days. And there's more changes in Europe as well. The 16th century also saw the end of the dream of political unity under the empire. There's not going to be just a one empire anymore. This is already, we've talked a lot about this. Nationalism fragmenting into states and countries has begun, and there's no going back to there being a one empire idea. The last emperor in this vein was Charles V. After him, the European emperors were little more than kings of Germany. And even those kings of Germany didn't necessarily have a lot of power. And in fact, many of them were figureheads, and maybe they had one part of Germany to rule, but they really didn't rule the whole thing. So the emperor idea is gone now. Finally, after all this time, going back through the Roman Empire, the emperor of a united people over vast areas is gone. It's not going to come back. Now it's going to be different states or different countries eventually. And the idea of that emperor, Charles V, was the last one of them. After that, they may have had the title emperor, but it really didn't mean what it used to. The conciliarist hope of Reformation was also shaken. So this was the group that wanted to have councils, like a universal council where the Pope wouldn't be the one who got to decide everything, but that there would be input from others. That hope that would actually bring reform it's going to finally be shaken to the point that it's going to be realized that that's not going to happen. It had been tried for a long time. And even the Protestant reformers had set their hopes on a universal council, which would prove them right and reunify the church. These early reformers, Martin Luther probably primarily the one among them, but all the early ones, they had as their goal to reconnect with the church. They never wanted to split off. It was hurtful to them. They didn't like it, and they saw it as being a bad thing. It was a big issue. And they really thought if they could ever get that council, if they could ever get that one universal council where the Pope had to kind of stay to the background and they could make their case, that they could get the church to make some reformation of doctrine, which is what they wanted. And they were willing. They would have made compromises to do it. They really wanted to get back in together. But those hopes and dreams are going to go away because the opposite is what actually happened. The papacy led the Reformation of the Catholic Church. So it wasn't a council that did it. It was the popes. And when there finally was this next big universal council, the Council of Trent, it wasn't these groups that came to kind of put the Pope in check. It was actually the opposite. The Pope used that council to put everybody else in check. And so the hopes and dreams of being able to have a council that would fairly evaluate Protestant ideas and look at doctrinal problems, all of that faded away with the Council of Trent. That's gone now. There's not going to be a recombining of the Protestants with the Catholics together. That's not going to happen. It's now split, and the schism can never be fixed. And finally, that realization came into play. So as we finish out, let's look at some conclusions about this last period of history that we've studied. The Protestant and Catholic Christians of the 16th century saw many of the old ways crumble around them. Both groups saw a lot of change. They didn't necessarily not desire it, but they saw it all the same. The medieval foundations, the papacy, the empire, and tradition were no longer solid. They had been put into question. The church was in question. If the Protestants could gain the ground that they had and split off, then there were serious questions even for those that stayed in Catholicism. And then the emperor, the idea of an empire, all of those things, the things that everybody thought that they could rely on, the big institutions, are the foundations of those are not solid any longer. So that's going to really shake people up during this time. Social and political commotions were frequent. So there's a lot of upheaval, a lot of change. The ancient feudal system was giving way to the early stages of capitalism. So the way the whole world worked economically is going to change. So there's just a lot of change that's coming at this time. Could the people at that time really understand and see it all in perspective the way that we can with the benefit of hindsight? No, but they definitely knew that they were living in turbulent times and things were not the way that they had always been. Yet in the midst of chaotic times, Christian reformers stood firm on their faith in the power of the Word of God. One of the things that these reformers kind of always held in the back of their head and their mind was that, yeah, there were serious problems with the Catholic Church, but as long as the Catholic Church didn't wholly abandon the Word of God, it wasn't a hopeless case because the Word of God contained the truth. And that true message could eventually bring Catholicism to, at least in some ways, affirm what the Protestants had said were issues. So it was, even with it being a chaotic time, those Christian reformers held that hope in their heart. And they really did have a very strong belief in the power of the Word of God. And they did hold that hope that, as long as the Bible is not abandoned, there's still hope. But there were two cataclysmic events that dominated the history of Christianity in the 16th century. Obviously, the Reformation, but then the colonization of new lands as well. Bringing Christianity around the world into new countries is going to be a major deal going forward. Obviously, the Protestant Reformation is. You don't have to overstate it. We know. It was a huge shift in church history. But the spreading of the Western culture around the world, and with it, the spreading of Western Christianity is going to be as a big of an effect, and possibly you could argue maybe ultimately a bigger effect. And so those two events really dominated what happened during the 16th century as we go forward. It is impossible to know which of these two events will ultimately have had a greater impact on the future history of Christianity. Most anybody that's doing a study of history would put the Protestant Reformation first. But we really don't know ultimately how people will look back on it and see what the biggest impact was. Was it that the church split into two groups? Or will it have ultimately been the spread of Western culture and Christianity around the world as a result of the colonization of new lands? You can make a case for each one. I don't know that we really know, and we maybe never will know that for sure. It's probably going to be a matter of opinion, honestly. But regardless of which one is ultimately going to be the biggest deal, they're both huge. And that's what we're going to be looking at as we move forward in our study. So that's it. I told you this was a shorter one, but it does get us into this transition into the next part. So when we come back next week, we're going to start part 2 of the book, Orthodoxy, Rationalism, and Pietism. And you'll get an opportunity to kind of get a taste of what the next part's going to be as we move forward in the study. And so thank you once again for taking time with me today. Hope that this has been a good looking back on this first part, and hope you feel a sense of accomplishment that you made it through the first part. And we've gotten the major points of the Reformation behind us now. And we're going to see now the results of it as it spreads around the world, and also Catholicism as well. So thanks again for being here. Hope that you have a blessed rest of your week. God bless.